to the RASC, Royal Astronomical Society of Canada, Edmonton Center's Astroimaging for Beginners. I'm Jay Lavender, the presiding president of the RASC Edmonton Center. And I just want to thank you for joining us on our first of what we hope will be many astroimaging workshops geared towards helping you get started in astroimaging and gain some confidence, some insight, and experience in what can be an incredibly complex and intimidating aspect of astronomy. So I do have to mention, as Abdur just alluded to there, that this workshop is being recorded, and so your continued participation in the workshop implies your consent to be recorded. There is a lot of ground to cover this evening, and we will allocate time at the end of the presentation for the questions and answers, again, as Abdur alluded to there. So we just ask folks to please withhold your questions until the end of the presentation. And so without any further ado, I am proud to introduce to you RASC Edmonton Center member and astroimaging aficionado, Abdur Anwar. So take it away, Abdur.
Awesome. Thank you for the introduction, Jay. Okay, let's get started. Okay, so as Jay stated, this presentation is geared towards beginners or for anyone who might be wanting to get into astrophotography but doesn't know where to start, or someone who is already an astrophotographer but just wants to learn a few more tips and tricks. So everything I'll be sharing should be fairly easy to follow, but if you do have any questions about any part of it, I'll be happy to answer any questions that we have at the end. So what I'm hoping we'll be able to go over in this presentation is any questions you might have about equipment options, about smart telescopes, cell phone astrophotography, anything like that, mono or color astrophotography, selecting appropriate gain or ISO settings, determining the length of exposures to use, any recommended programs for image capture or guiding, the importance of calibration frames such as darks, flats, bias, dark flats, and best practices for using them, planning an effective image capturing session, and of course, there'll be time for any questions and answers at the end. Now, quick history of my journey in astrophotography. I've been interested in astronomy and astrophotography for as long as I can remember, astronomy in particular for about the last 30 years. But I didn't actually get into it or meet any other astronomers until perhaps a little over the last decade. So that's when I really started getting into it. I got a telescope. I bought a DSLR camera off Kijiji and started taking pictures. And then I've been a member of RASC Edmonton and now RASC Calgary as well for a while now. And I've attended tons of events and public outreach. And yeah, I'm sure most of you have seen me at a lot of the events and star parties. And I've thoroughly enjoyed my time. And now I'm hoping that I can give back in a way based on my experience and everything that I've learned in this hobby. And here are a couple of the telescopes, I guess, that I use or have used. This is just a selection of my equipment that I've accumulated over the last decade. And I use just about every kind of telescope design out there that's commonly available. So I think I should be at least somewhat qualified to comment on the pros and cons of the various designs. And what I'm hoping you'll be able to get out of this presentation is, of course, it should help you dip your toes in astrophotography. I'm hoping you'll get at least one useful tip out of this presentation. I'm hoping this can be a starting point to choosing equipment or learning to use what you already have more effectively. I'm hoping that after this presentation, anyone who's just getting started won't find astrophotography as daunting as it may seem. You don't need any fancy equipment to take part in astrophotography. Even very, very basic equipment such as your cell phone can be quite sufficient to get started. And I spent a lot of time collecting data using my cell phone or my DSLR just to show you what is possible using basic equipment like that. And one thing that I want to stress is that astrophotography is not a competition. So if you see some fancy images online from one of the pros like Adam Block, don't let that deter you. Everyone has their own journey. And the important thing is just to do the best that you can with the equipment you have, whether you're using, some fancy plane wave or whether you're using your cell phone. And then, of course, I'm open to answer any questions you would have at the end. So we're going to go over some equipment options initially. So that will include wide field astrophotography, such as phones, DSLRs, mirrorless cameras, and smart telescopes. I'll cover lunar, solar, and planetary imaging. And then I'll cover some more advanced techniques for deep sky imaging. But it is all still tailored for beginners. Okay, so I want to start off by comparing the various scope designs. So I ended up making this little chart that I'm hoping will be helpful for that. And the first kind of telescope design that everyone is familiar with, that you can see on the left side in the picture there, that is a refractor telescope, which is basically very, very similar to a lens that you might use for a DSLR or mirrorless camera. So I've lumped camera lenses in there as well. The second design is a refractor, a Newtonian reflector telescope, which is a very, very common design because it offers very good value for the aperture or for how much light it can collect. And there's the Schmidt-Cassegrain, which is like the popular Celestron C8 design. And those range in size from 4 inches all the way to 14 inches are fairly common. And then there's the RASA or Hyperstar. So I separated that from the regular Schmidt-Cassegrain designs just because they have completely different strengths and weaknesses. Now, the first aspect of them that I want to touch on is speed. That is how quickly that particular scope design collects light. And the star system that I used, the more stars that particular design is showing, the better it is. And the less stars that I have put for it, the worse it is for that particular aspect of astrophotography. So an imaging refractor or a lens, in terms of speed, I gave it 2 stars out of 4 because it collects light fairly quickly. Most astrophotography refractors, most imaging refractors, which happen to be ED, which is extra low dispersion glass, or triplet refractors, those are the common ones right now. Most of the ones I've seen are between f5 and f6. Those are the most common focal ratios. So they tend to collect light pretty quickly. So you don't need to spend a lot of time collecting data to get a pretty good image. And then in terms of lenses, actually lenses can be faster. So you can have lenses down to f2, but primarily I'm focusing on imaging refractors here. So 2 stars out of 4, they're pretty good at that. Now, imaging reflectors, generally, these tend to be f4 or f5 focal ratio. So they collect light pretty quickly, faster than most imaging refractor telescopes, which is good. So you don't have to spend 30 hours collecting data. And this imaging reflector that I have in the picture here at number 2 position, this one is an Orion 8-inch f3.9 reflector, and this has been my primary imaging telescope for a very, very long time. And the reason I've kept it around for all that time is because it collects data very, very fast at f3.9, so I'm pretty happy with that. Next is the Schmidt-Cassegrain. I only gave that 1 star because generally Schmidt-Cassegrains have a focal ratio of f10. So they tend to be pretty slow at collecting light. So you do need to spend a lot of time collecting data to get a good image with a high signal to noise ratio. But you can use a focal reducer to bring it down to f7, which is a bit more competitive then with the refractor telescopes or with imaging reflectors. But on a comparative scale, I gave it a 1 star. And Rasa or Hyperstar, these ones I've given 4 stars because by default, they are at f2, which is very, very fast. So if you're comparing, let's say, f2 to f4, you just square the number. So you're comparing 4 by 16. So a Rasa or Hyperstar at f2 will be 4 times faster than an imaging reflector at f4. So the Rasas or Hyperstars are very, very good at collecting a lot of photons very quickly. So you can get a perfectly usable image with 1 hour of data. Now, in my experience, collimation is one of the main considerations, especially for anyone who is setting up and taking down their scope fairly often. If you never move your scope, you can just collimate it once and leave it in your observatory. But for most people, they try to take their telescope to a darker site, or they tear down and set up from scratch every time. So for that reason, I thought collimation would be important to put in here. So for an imaging refractor or a lens, I gave it 4 stars for collimation because in general, you do not need to collimate your refractor telescope or your camera lens. So that makes it basically foolproof. And if you're traveling with your scope lens or your imaging refractor, you don't have to worry about collimating it when you set up at the site. You just set it up and you're good to go. With imaging reflectors, like my Orion 8-inch f3.9 Newtonian reflector, I gave it a 2-star out of 4 because at a fast focal ratio of f4 or f5, they tend to be fairly demanding in terms of collimation. So especially if you're using a camera with a fairly large chip, such as an APS-C camera or a full frame camera, such as my Canon 6D, sorry, there's some loud noise going on outside. Okay, no idea what that is. Apologies for that. So in terms of collimation, the collimation has to be very exact. It has to be imaging Newtonian reflectors do have to be collimated very well, but collimating them is not particularly hard. You can use a Cheshire or a laser collimator as long as the laser collimator is collimated properly, which I've made videos on in the past, and it's fairly easy to do. So collimating a Newtonian reflector, is one of the challenges, but it's not that hard to do. And a Schmidt-Cassegrain, I gave it 3 stars out of 4. Schmidt-Cassegrains are fairly easy to collimate because of their long focal length and their slow focal ratio. So at f7 or f10, it's not very challenging to collimate them, and they generally hold their collimation fairly well. And even on an APS-C sensor or a full frame sensor, it's not too hard to collimate a Schmidt-Cassegrain well enough that you can get good round stars at all 4 corners of your imaging sensor. So that's why I gave it 3 stars out of 4. But if you turn your Schmidt-Cassegrain into a Hyperstar by using a Hyperstar adapter like I have in my picture at the very left, where the camera goes at the front, then that brings the focal ratio down to f2. And the Rasa, of course, has the same kind of design. So it has a very fast focal ratio of f2. So it collects light very, very fast. But the downside of that then is that the collimation has to be done very, very well and is very, very touchy. Just the telescope moving to a different part of the sky can shift the mirror enough to throw your collimation off. And so if you're getting good stars in one part of the sky, they might be slightly off in a different part of the sky. And collimating a Hyperstar or a Rasa at f2 with enough accuracy that you can get good stars at the corners of an APS-C sensor or a full frame sensor can be quite challenging, and sometimes you need specialized tools. Trying to do it by trial and error under the stars can be very, very challenging, as some of our members have found out, including me. I struggled with collimating a Hyperstar scope for many, many years, and it took me a long time to do it. So once I've collimated it, I like not to touch it. So I just leave my camera attached to the front when I take my scope down and I put it in a box for storage. So suitability for wide field imaging or large targets, such as the Andromeda Galaxy, imaging refractors or lenses are very, very good for that. Imaging reflector, and of course, imaging refractors most commonly have focal lengths between about 300 millimeters and 600 millimeters. And of course, lenses, you can get much, much wider. So, no matter how wide your target, most lenses will be able to fit the entire target. So that's why I gave it 4 stars. So if your main interest is imaging very large targets and very large dust clouds and the Andromeda Galaxy and the double cluster or the Heart and Soul Nebula, then a short imaging refractor is probably for you, or a lens. So imaging reflectors, generally they have focal lengths between about 600 millimeters and 1,000 millimeters. So I consider those medium focal lengths. My 8-inch Newtonian reflector down here has a focal length of about 800 millimeters. So that's why I gave 3 stars. It's wide enough for most targets. It can capture most of the Andromeda Galaxy, or a lot of the Andromeda Galaxy's interesting regions, but it can't capture the entire galaxy. And it's still long enough for most of the smaller targets, such as some planetary nebulae, some of the smaller galaxies or galaxy clusters. So an imaging reflector is a good jack of all trades that can cover both small objects and large objects. Schmidt-Cassegrains, generally, I gave it a 1 star out of 4 for wide field targets because the focal length most commonly is between about 1,200 millimeters and 2,800 millimeters. An 8-inch Schmidt-Cassegrain has a regular focal length of about 2,000 millimeters or 2 meters at f10. And if you're using a focal reducer, that brings it down to between 12 and 1,400 millimeters, depending on the model that you're using. A larger 11-inch Schmidt-Cassegrain like mine has a focal length of 2,800 millimeters. And if you're using a focal reducer, brings it down to a little under 2,000 millimeters. And smaller ones like the C6 are usually not as suited for imaging, so I'm going to leave that out. But in general, for wide field imaging, Schmidt-Cassegrains are not the ideal scope to pick if that's what you want to image. RASAs and hyperstars, very, very good for wide field imaging or for very large targets. My hyperstar C11 has a focal length of only 560 millimeters, and using my APS-C camera, the ASI 2600 MC, I can fit the entire Andromeda Galaxy in the frame. So if wide field imaging is what you want, that's a good option. Suitability for small targets, galaxies, planetary nebulae, if that's something you're interested in, then a small imaging refractor or lens is probably not going to be the scope that you choose. Now, there are always exceptions to every rule. So if you're getting, some ASCAR 185 APO, which weighs like 45 pounds and, is a huge, huge scope, of course, you can do small galaxies and planetary nebulae with that as well. But I'm mainly focusing on what is most commonly available for each type of telescope. So generally, for planetary nebulae, galaxies, and small targets, imaging refractor or lens is not what you want. Imaging reflector with a focal length usually between 600 millimeters and 1,000 millimeters for most commonly available imaging reflectors. It can do smaller galaxies or galaxy clusters and planetary nebulae as well, so that's a consideration. Schmidt-Cassegrains are great for smaller galaxies or planetary nebulae because of the long focal length. A planetary nebula like Messier 57 or the Ring Nebula that might look like a tiny little dot in your imaging refractor or lens, or a RASA or hyperstar will actually look quite large and pretty detailed in most Schmidt-Cassegrains because of their longer focal length. And you can always take off the focal reducer and image at f10 because smaller targets like planetary nebulae are usually fairly bright. And then RASAs or hyperstars, not suitable for galaxies or planetary nebulae. Usually, you can image a planetary nebula at 500 millimeters, but it's not going to look very impressive. It might look like a slightly detailed fuzzy star. And if you are planning to image the moon or the planets, so you're hoping to get some detail on Jupiter, get some of the detail on the cloud bands or the Great Red Spot, or get some detail in craters, then an imaging refractor or lens is probably not what you want. An imaging reflector can do a pretty decent job. Most imaging reflectors have a high enough resolution due to the fairly large mirror between 6 and 12 inches that they will give you good details on the planet or the moon as long as you use a Barlow. And for lunar or planetary or solar imaging, you can use a Barlow, unlike deep sky. So imaging reflectors, 3 stars out of 4, they're pretty good for that. Schmidt-Cassegrains, again, very, very good for imaging the planets or the moon. And they can give you very, very good detail even without a Barlow, but you can always put in a 2 or 3 times Barlow to really get in there and zoom in and to get that fine detail in the lunar craters or on Jupiter. So they are the instrument of choice for most serious and advanced planetary imagers. If you've seen any images from Damien Peach of details on Jupiter's moon Ganymede, he uses a Celestron C14 Edge HD most of the time. Or he also has a giant, I believe, an RC in Barbados, but most of the time from home, he uses the Celestron C14. And then the RASA or the Hyperstar design, I do not recommend it for planets or the moon. You can get some images of the moon that'll show craters, but the focal length is just not long enough, and you can't use a Barlow or a Teleview PowerMate to try to increase the magnification. And the RASA and the Hyperstar designs are kind of compromised designs. So in general, they're not going to be quite as sharp in terms of detail as a Schmidt-Cassegrain or an imaging reflector. So I don't recommend those for planets or the moon. Now, one of the very, very important considerations for anyone looking to get into astrophotography or trying to decide what scope to get is what mount to get. So the common saying is that you should probably spend about 70% of your total astrophotography budget on buying the mount, and then spend whatever you have left over on the telescope and the camera. And that's something I've learned the hard way over the years. I've owned countless mounts that I bought generally off Kijiji because I had to save some money. And then eventually I ended up upgrading those mounts. And then eventually I learned my lesson and I bought a good mount, well, 2 good mounts now. I have the Ioptron SEM 70, which was well over my budget, but I splurged on the mount. And then I have the EQ6R, which I actually bought new. So since then, I've kept those 2 mounts, and I've been changing out and buying new optical tubes, new telescopes, but I've kept those mounts. So for anyone looking to get into astrophotography or trying to decide what to buy, I say spend as much of your budget as you can on the mount, because you probably won't be using the same telescope in 5 years. But if you get a good mount, you'll probably be using the same mount. So now that that's out of the way, what telescope to get? Well, in terms of mount requirements, imaging refractors or lenses, they will work with just about any mount. As you can see in my left picture over here, this is a William Optics GT71 refractor. It's a small 71 millimeter refractor, and I have it on an Ioptron Skyguider. So not a very heavy duty mount at all, but it was tracking fairly fine with that. So imaging refractors or lenses generally do not require a very beefy mount. If you have a beefy mount, they'll be more stable and they will resist the wind much better or vibrations, but it's not a requirement. Imaging reflectors, I have found, because of their medium focal length, usually between 600 and 1,000 millimeters, they don't require a very beefy mount, but they do tend to be somewhat heavy. And they do tend to be a little bit off balance depending on where you've placed your camera. As you can see in my picture, my camera is facing downwards, but when the scope is pointing to the west, it's off to one side, and when it's pointing, the camera's angle changes based on where in the sky the telescope is pointing. So balance is crucial with Newtonian reflectors. So I give it 2 stars. They do require a fairly beefy mount, especially for their aperture, but their focal length is not very long, so they're not as demanding in terms of tracking. So I usually recommend something like a EQ6R or an HEQ5 or Ioptron SEM40 class mount for the average Newtonian reflector, like my 8-inch f3.9. Now, Schmidt-Cassegrains, I gave it a 1 star in terms of mount requirements because they have a long focal length. So at generally at any focal length over about 1,000 millimeters, you will need a fairly good mount, because if your mount is experiencing any vibrations or it's being pushed around by the wind, or it doesn't track very well at the long focal length of a Schmidt-Cassegrain, you will definitely notice that pretty quickly. So if you're using a C6, C8, or a C11, then make sure your mount is capable of guiding or tracking at a long focal length. So in that picture, I was using my Ioptron SEM70 with that C11 because my EQ6R wasn't quite doing the job. However, I have now moved my C11 Edge HD to my EQ6R because now with the Hyperstar that I'm using with it, now it is adequate. So with RASAs or Hyperstars, even though they weigh just as much or more than an equivalent C11 or Schmidt-Cassegrain, they have a very short focal length. So my C11 with the Hyperstar, as you can see with the camera at the front, has a focal length of only 560 millimeters. And a 11-inch RASA will have a similar focal length. So at that focal length, they're not very demanding on tracking at all, but you still have to make sure that the mount is capable of carrying the weight. So my C11 with the Hyperstar on there is getting pretty close to the maximum limit of what an EQ6R can carry, which is 44 pounds. But it's still more than adequate just because of how short the focal length is. So a Hyperstar or RASA, as long as your mount can carry the weight, it's not demanding at all in terms of mount requirements. So I'm hoping that chart will help you just get a start on what kind of telescope to get and what their relative strengths and weaknesses are. And this is, of course, based just on my experiences, and there will always be outliers. If you get a very large refractor, which are, again, not that common, like the 7.5-inch ASCAR triplet APO that recently came out, that weighs, I think, around 45 pounds or so. So, of course, that is going to buck the trend of mount requirements for imaging refractors. But since there are maybe, a handful of them out there right now, I did not take that into consideration. I went with the usual 2 to 4-inch apochromatic refractors that people normally use for imaging. So this is not a definitive guide. This is just a guideline based on my experiences using all of these different kinds of telescopes. Okay, so one thing I recently got into is cell phone astrophotography. Now, that might sound like a misnomer. Can you really do astrophotography with a cell phone? And if you check some of those forums online or some Facebook groups, such as the astrophotography or backyard astrophotography or any of those Facebook groups, every time somebody posts a picture taken with a cell phone showing the night sky, the comment section usually erupts saying, "That's not real astrophotography, get a real camera," or something like that. But modern cell phones are surprisingly capable in what they can do. And I did a lot of experimenting for this presentation because I know everybody in the modern world has a cell phone, almost everybody at least. And not everybody has a DSLR or a smart telescope or a cooled astro camera. So I wanted to see what was actually possible with a cell phone. And this picture over here, which in reality looks sharper than how it looks over here on the Zoom screen right now to me. This was taken handheld from my driveway, which is a Bortle 6 to 7 location, using a Google Pixel 6a. And this was a single shot using night mode on my phone. And of course, it is untracked. And this is completely straight out of the phone, just a JPEG as the phone took it, with no additional processing on the phone or on the computer or anything like that. So this is what a modern, well, somewhat modern cell phone can do. Mine is the Google Pixel 6a, which I'd got. I think I'd paid like $300 on Boxing Day for it. So it's not a high-end phone. It's not the Pixel 8 or Samsung Galaxy Ultra S22 or whatever they're at now. But even a fairly basic phone like this can take pretty good night pictures. The key is to learn what features your phone has that can help you in that. And night mode, as it's called on the Google Pixel 6a, is indispensable. And it has it basically blew away all my expectations once I started experimenting with it. I know pretty much all iPhones made in the last couple of years are capable of excellent night images, as well as just about any Samsung Galaxy phone from the last couple of years. So you will have to look up and see what the feature is called in your phone. But on my on my Google Pixel 6a, all I have to do is open up the camera app and just select the night mode, as it's called. Just make sure that is what it's called still. Yep, night sight. That's what it's called on mine. So I will tell you about all the different settings to use. But one useful gadget that I found for imaging with a phone, if you want to get a little bit more serious than just using handheld shots, is to get a phone adapter like this one. This is a 1/4-inch cell phone holder. So this allows you to attach it, and that's the holder. Put a picture off on the left. That allows you to put your cell phone onto a regular basic photo tripod. So you probably already have a photo tripod for your camera. You can attach your cell phone to that, and that way you can get a more steady shot. You don't have to hand hold it for 4 seconds or however long the picture is taking. And this is another shot I had taken from the same time. This was, again, the Aurora storm. Just single shot straight out of the cell phone with automatic settings using the night sight mode.
Do you use any zoom?
No, and for these ones, I don't think I used any zoom, but I may have selected the 2x option. I think if you select the 2 option on my Google Pixel 6a phone, it simply just uses digital zoom to zoom in more. I don't think it has optical zoom, but you can use it. I do find, though, that the wide angle cameras tend to be better sometimes because they usually have a faster lens. But if your target is small or the aurora is concentrated in one part of the sky, then you can hit the 2x option. I wouldn't recommend zooming in too much, 5x or 10x, even if it is optical zoom, because then you're getting less light coming in and the image quality drops if you use digital zoom on a cell phone or on any camera, really. So I wouldn't recommend zooming in too much. And of course, if you do have any particular question or I missed something, you can still jump in. Just jump in and I'll answer any questions. But for more of the complicated questions, we can wait till the end for those. So this is another image that I had taken, which again looks better on my computer than it does on Zoom right now, but it gives you an idea of what is possible with a cell phone. And this is a single shot with my Google Pixel 6a cell phone using the night sight option. And I have given the up at the top right over here, I've given the settings for all the pictures that I have taken. So this was, again, an untracked single shot, but it was put on a tripod for this one using this kind of adapter that I have a picture of. So it doesn't shake because I can't hold my hand steady for 30 seconds. And I didn't use any special settings. I just let the phone do everything. So I just put it on a tripod, faced it up towards the sky. You can see Orion setting at the very bottom here. And I think you can see Cassiopeia on the right as well. And I just hit I just hit the shutter button. Actually, I used the 3-second self timer on it, and it did everything else by itself. And I just used JPEG mode. There was no point I found using RAW mode because it resizes the image to half the size if I was shooting in RAW mode for some reason. But since the phone's doing all the processing by itself, I just left it in JPEG mode and told it to take a picture. And this is the result that I got, which was pretty good. You can actually see the glow of the Orion Nebula at the very bottom here. So one other option, a slightly more advanced option for cell phone astrophotography, is to use an eyepiece adapter such as this Move, Shoot, Move Tridapter. Many companies make them. I know Celestron has their own version as well. You can also get a very, very basic one, such as this little guy I have here, which I won at the last Northern Prairie Star Party. But this one over here that I have in the picture there as well, this is the Move, Shoot, Move Tridapter, which is more expensive. I think this one's over $100 usually, whereas the very basic one is, you can get them for about $20. And what this does is this can allow you to attach your cell phone to your eyepiece. And then you can attach it to your telescopes, your solar telescope, your binoculars, your nighttime viewing telescope. This won't give you quite the same results as a proper expensive astro camera on on an equatorial mount, but you'll be surprised at the results that you can get with just your cell phone, a adapter like this, and a scope hooked up to an eyepiece. So there, I was hooking it up to my Coronado eyepiece. I was using a 21 millimeter wide angle eyepiece, the Bader Hyperion 21. And I had my TeleVue PowerMate 2.5x Barlow, or you can use any Barlow really, it'll do the same job. And this was the first image that I had taken. Again, it doesn't look as sharp as it does in person. Let me see if I can pull it up here for you actually, just to show you what it actually looks like. There we go, okay. So, there, I think it was this one that I had used. But as you can see, it looks much sharper over here than it does in that in the Zoom presentation for some reason. But it gives you an idea of what is possible just by attaching your cell phone to your eyepiece and just hitting shoot with no other settings. You can see all these prominences on the outer region of the sun. On the surface, you can see many other prominences. You can see these little dots all over the sun's surface. So it can do quite a bit. And in the next shot, same thing. I just used the 2x zoom function on my phone. And you can see quite a few prominences on the solar edge. And you can see a sunspot down here near the bottom left as well. And again, all on auto using this Move, Shoot, Move Tridapter and the Coronado PSD solar telescope. Now, if you don't have a solar telescope, of course, you can just hook up your cell phone to your binoculars. And this was through my 30 by 100 binoculars, but I mean, you can use, regular 50 millimeter binoculars, 10 by 50 or 15 by 50. You'll just get an image that's about half the zoom, but you'll still get excellent detail. And this was just attaching my Tridapter and my cell phone to my to the eyepiece of my binocular, and then I can use the slow motion controls on this adapter to center the view. And the first was a wide field view, and the second was using the 2x zoom option on my phone. And you can see quite a bit of detail actually in the full image. You see tons of craters. I could see the Alpine Valley at the top as well. I think these are the Apennines Mountains, so mountain ranges. And by attaching my cell phone using the same adapter to my big Dobsonian telescope, I was able to get even more detail in some of the lunar craters. Now, what we're looking at over here, right at the very center, is a crater called Hasadus A. I don't exactly know how to pronounce it because I've only ever read the name. But it's a very interesting crater because you can see this double crater, perfectly concentric. There is an outer crater, and then there is an inner crater right in the center of the outer crater. I'm not sure exactly how it was formed, but I got a more zoomed in crop on the right of the same crater. Now, this is a target that I almost never see imaged. I've seen a couple of very, very experienced astrophotographers image it recently with their C14 Edge HDs using proper astro cameras. And the image I got with my cell phone was very, very close to it. Theirs might have slightly more depth and dynamic range, but I mean, I was surprised how much detail I could get on a crater that's only 14 kilometers across, so smaller than the average city on the moon, 385,000 kilometers away. So this is by far my best result on this crater. I had previously tried imaging this crater multiple times using my actual astro camera, the QHY 462, which is one of the best planetary cameras available right now. But my results were nowhere near what I was able to get with my cell phone attached to my eyepiece. Now, part of the reason for that was that the seeing was exceptionally good that night. I think better than I've ever seen it before. So that definitely helped. But the phone itself was no slouch. And one of the things that sometimes we don't realize is that the imaging sensors inside your cell phone is often the same imaging sensor that's used in high-end planetary cameras. It's just that your phone can do all of that processing and noise reduction and everything automatically. So you don't need to spend as much time on it afterwards. And this was, of course, taken with my Google Pixel 6a using a 16-inch DOB. But when you're using a DOB that big, oftentimes you're limited by the atmosphere. So using an 8-inch or a 10-inch DOB, I could get very close to this image already because the seeing is the main limit. And I was using a 2.5 Barlow and my 8mm eyepiece in this case to get up close and personal there. And this was a single 40-second stack of videos that I then ran through my usual processing software for planets, which I'll detail later. I used AutoStacker and Registax. And that was it. No additional processing. I just cropped it and pasted it over here. So also I will probably be using my cell phone a lot more in the future just because of how much more convenient it was than using a proper planetary camera for planetary imaging in the future. And as far as deep sky imaging, you can use your cell phone to do some deep sky imaging. Of course, I don't recommend it, but if you have a cell phone and you have a telescope that can track, even if it's just an Altaz mount, you have an 8-inch Dobsonian, Skywatcher SynScan Dob that can track in alt-azimuth, well, hook up your cell phone to it and see what you can get. This image of the Orion Nebula was again taken with my Google Pixel 6a. I had attached it to an 8mm eyepiece on my 8-inch reflector on a tracking mount. This was a single shot in night mode taken using basically just the automatic settings. This is a JPEG straight out of the phone because I didn't do any further editing or processing to it. This is just how it came out of the camera. And one of the advantages of using your cell phone, if it has night mode, is that in night mode, your phone automatically takes a couple of short exposures and stacks them. So even if your tracking on your telescope or your mount is not very good, it will automatically compensate for that. Now, at least on the Google Pixel 6a, it takes a total of 4 minutes of exposures, and each of the sub-exposures is usually 15 seconds. And then it combines all of those short 15-second exposures into one long 4-minute exposure. So it's basically the same thing that we manually do, but it just does that automatically. All you have to do is hit the start button, or better yet, the way I did it is just turn on the 3-second self timer so you're not shaking your phone when you touch the screen to start taking the picture. So that's all it took to take this image. I'm surprised that the dynamic range is fairly good. You can see detail near the center. You can see some detail in the outer regions of the nebula. So I was pretty happy with it. I also tried the Horsehead Nebula. I tried one or two other ones as well, like the Crab Nebula, and I was able to see them just fine in a single shot. And if I took multiple shots like that and just stacked them at the end, I would likely get a much better result. But since I'm going for simplicity with cell phone astrophotography, I didn't bother with any manual stacking or taking raw frames. I just let the phone do everything and just took one picture to share over here just to show what can be done with a basic telescope and a basic phone. This was actually another image I had taken with the same setup, Google Pixel 6a, 8mm eyepiece on an 8-inch reflector that was tracking. And this is Messier 37, one of the clusters that's well positioned right now. And of course, you can see the nice color in the stars there. Now, some tips for phone photography, which some of which I already discussed, was use night mode on your phone if it supports it. For better images, a tracking mount or star tracker is recommended, such as the Ioptron Sky Guider, Skywatcher Star Adventurer, or basically any tracking mount. You can use a phone adapter with a quarter inch thread to attach your phone to a tripod or tracker for just wide angle photography. If you're using a phone eyepiece adapter to attach your phone to your eyepiece, you could do that like I did for most of my deep sky images there, or for my solar or lunar images. If your phone doesn't have a built-in night mode, you can use apps such as Astrocam for Android. It allows you to take multiple images, including in RAW mode, that you can then stack, or you can take a single longer exposure. Or you can use an app called Deep Sky Camera for Android, which supports RAW. It supports focus assist, so you can focus on a star much easier. It also supports sequential shooting, where you're taking multiple exposures in a row if you want to stack them at the end, like we normally do with our Astro cameras. So those are just a few of the options available. Now, some of the settings I would recommend for wide field phone astrophotography. So that was that wide field shot you saw in the beginning with the tiny Orion at the bottom, was to, of course, use the self-timer function so you don't shake your camera. If you're using night mode, the phone will take care of everything. If you are using manual mode because your phone doesn't support night mode, or you're using one of those apps, use medium to high ISO, such as ISO 800 or 1600. It will create a noisier image, but you will get more detail and your image will look nicer and brighter. So use the wide angle lens of your phone if possible. It usually collects more light. It's usually at f1.8 or f1.5 in some cases, versus your telephoto lens or your regular lens on your phone, which is usually at f2.5 or f3. If you're using manual mode, use the longest shutter speed that you can use without getting star trails. So set your shutter speed to 15 seconds to start. And if your photo is showing trails, then decrease it. If there are no trails, try increasing it to maybe 30 seconds. And if your phone doesn't manually let you select the exposure time, you can use one of those apps that I had mentioned before. And in most cases, if your phone isn't too old, they will allow you to manually select the shutter speed. If your phone does have automatic night mode, though, it'll take care of everything. All you normally have to do is hit the start button, and it'll take multiple 15-minute exposures and then stack them all into one really long 4-minute exposure. And you don't have to worry about star trails in that case. And in terms of settings, if you are using your phone through an eyepiece, like I was for a lot of my recent shots that I showed, use the self-timer function still. If you are using night mode, again, phone will take care of everything. If you are using night mode for deep sky imaging, use medium high ISO, such as 800 or 1600. Most modern phones will handle high ISOs like that fairly well. If it is too noisy, then drop it down to ISO 400. If you're using the manual mode, use the longest shutter speed that you can use without star trails. This might be limited by your focal length or zoom, or just by the tracking of your telescope. If you are imaging the sun with a proper solar filter, or the moon, then in that case, you don't need tracking really. It's definitely helpful. But in that case, use your phone's regular mode, not the night mode, because the sun and the moon are quite bright as is. In terms of processing, again, if using night mode on your cell phone, no processing is needed. You still can, it's optional, but it's not required. You can still get good images without it. But for manually processing your photo, adjusting the brightness, increasing the contrast, you can use an app called Snapseed, which is completely free for Android and iOS. And of course, you can always send your image to your computer, and then you can process it there using whatever software you want to use, whether it's PixInsight or anything. Now you could use a DSLR or mirrorless camera. So this was a wide field shot taken from a Canon 6D DSLR, which by now is very old, but it's still a phenomenal DSLR. And this was in a Bortle 4 sky, so fairly dark, just south of Calgary at the observatory. I used a Rokinon 135mm f2 lens. I used a star tracker, and this was later processed and in PixInsight and cropped. So this was, I can't remember which comet it was. It might have been Comet Lemon, but I've imaged quite a few so far, so I lose track of them. But it turned out quite well for just a Canon 6D and a Rokinon 135mm lens. You can buy the Canon 6D on the used market for very cheap. I think I had paid $300 for mine, which, it's a great value compared to an Astro camera. And it's one of the most underrated deals right now for astrophotography for anybody getting started. You can do, really good deep sky astrophotography with it, whether you're using a telescope or a lens. And the Rokinon or Samyang 135mm f2 lens is, in my opinion, one of the best deals available right now for wide field astrophotography. And I have it right here. So this is my setup. I just put a dovetail underneath so I can hook it up to my Astro mounts. But again, does a great job. So this was a wide field shot that I had taken using my Fuji X-T2 12mm mirrorless camera. And this was at a fairly dark, I would say, Bortle 2 sky in northern Pakistan when I went back to visit my village. So not a lot of light pollution there. But this was I think this was a single 60-second shot using my 12mm wide angle lens on a star tracker. And of course, you can see a lot of detail in the Milky Way there. And again, I apologize for the blurriness of the image. When I transferred it to Zoom, it didn't upload in the highest of resolutions, but you get the idea of what is possible there. And I think on the right, that was Jupiter at the time, if I remember correctly. And this was a shot I had taken of the lagoon in the Trifid Nebula using a Fuji X-T2 mirrorless camera and the kit zoom lens. This was a single shot of 3 minutes, and it was processed in Deep Sky Stacker and GIMP. And no, actually, this was not a single shot. Sorry, this was multiple 3-minute shots. And I believe the total exposure time was between 20 and 30 minutes. But this was from a very, very dark, I would say almost Bortle 1 sky. So you get a lot more detail there. So it is very important if you can to get to a dark sky, but not essential, as some of the earlier images you saw were shot from the suburbs of Cochrane, pretty close to downtown, actually. So dark sky is not essential, just helpful. This was an image I had taken of the of the Horsehead Nebula region, and on the right you can see the Orion Nebula. Again, this was with the Canon 6D and a 135mm wide field lens. This was a total of 15 minutes of exposures only. So I took 15 exposures of 60 minutes each and then stacked and processed them. So you can get a decent amount of detail using not a lot of exposure time with fairly basic equipment. And one last one, again, Fuji X-T2 kit lens, almost 2 hours of data, and using a star tracker. And this is the elephant's trunk region here. And of course, the Andromeda Galaxy, same thing, 45 minutes of total exposures, same equipment as before. So some recommendations for wide field astrophotography is, of course, to use a star tracker. It's recommended. You don't need it. I've taken some pretty good images with just a wide field lens on a stationary tripod. But in that case, you have to take a lot of images and the sky will be moving relative to you because your tripod is stationary. And that's how I started out. And that's what I did for many years when I didn't have a star tracker. But if you're able to get a star tracker, highly recommend it. Some popular ones are the Ioptron Sky Guider Pro, Skywatcher Star Adventurer, or the GTI model for GoTo, the Vixen Polari, or a smaller portable mount like an Explore Scientific IXOS 100. I highly recommend a fast lens such as a Canon 50mm 1.8, Rokinon or Samyang 14mm f2.8, which is another one I use for very wide field imaging, or the Rokinon or Samyang, they're the same company basically, 135mm f2 lens, the ones I had used to take this shot of the comet in the background. So I highly recommend using an intervalometer. So what that does is it's this little kit that or little piece of equipment that you attach to your DSLR or mirrorless camera. And then instead of standing there and hitting the button and then waiting 60 seconds, hitting the button again, this allows you to completely automate it. So you select how many images you want, how long you want each image to be, set your camera to bulb mode, and hit start on the intervalometer, and it'll automatically take all the pictures you want, and then you can go to bed. A few cameras like my Fuji XS10 do have a built-in intervalometer, so I can automatically tell it how many images to take, how long each of them should be, but most cameras do not have this option. You can center a bright star on your screen and focus on that automatically or manually. For wide field imaging, I generally recommend just manually focusing because sometimes the autofocus on cameras is not very accurate. And for precise focusing, I recommend using a Batinov mask. So I have one with me here. We can take a look at it after as well. This is a little one that I 3D printed for myself, and they're very easy to 3D print, but you just put this in front of your lens and then it'll allow you to get precise focus. And as far as settings for wide field imaging with DSLRs or mirrorless cameras, or really any sort of imaging, always shoot in RAW mode instead of JPEG. That'll preserve the most amount of information because you'll be doing the processing later instead of processing in the phone like you would with cell phones. I recommend setting your camera to daylight white balance. This only affects the preview in RAW mode, but it's always good practice to do. It'll just simplify things a little bit for you later when you're looking at the images. So in your settings, daylight white balance always looks like a little sun under white balance. So set your camera to daylight white balance, and you can always set it back to auto white balance afterwards if you're imaging, a wedding or something in the daytime. Use medium to high ISO, such as ISO 800 or 1600 for any DSLR or mirrorless cameras. In 95% of the cases, that'll be a good ISO to use. So if you're just getting started, you don't know what ISO or gain to select, use that to get started. We'll cover the more advanced options afterwards. Use the widest aperture on your lens, such as f1.8, to let in as much light as possible. Some people use a smaller aperture. They stop down an f1.8 lens to, f3.5 or f4. In my opinion, you are losing way too much light in that case for it to be worth it. You don't need the most pinpoint stars. Just good enough stars will work. So the image you're seeing in the background, this was shot with my lens wide open at f1.8, and this is not a premium lens. Brand new, you get it for about $600 usually. But my stars turned out pretty good over there. I'll share with you here a clearer version of this picture that's not on Zoom. So as you can see over here, the stars look pretty good, even wide open at f1.8. So I have no complaints about them. So the trick is just to choose a lens that's known for its astrophotography performance. So most lenses from Rokinon or Samyang tend to be pretty good. And if you do get a bad copy, you can just return it to the wherever you bought it and exchange it for a better one. So most of the time, though, I have found their performance to be very good, even at the edges. And if you don't want to spend $3,000 on a very, very well-corrected, premium Canon L lens, then they are a good option. The only downside tends to be that they're manual focus, but for astrophotography, that does not matter. And so there was that. So in terms of exposure length for wide field astrophotography with a DSLR or mirrorless camera, you are limited by how well your mount tracks and the accuracy of your polar alignment. If your polar alignment is off, no matter how good your mount is, you are not going to get pinpoint stars. You will get trailing. And if your images are trailing, try decreasing your exposure time. So if you're using a DSLR or mirrorless camera with a tracking mount, which I recommend over here, then 60 seconds is a good starting point. That's what I use as standard with my Skyguider Pro and my Canon 6D camera. But if you get tracking, if you get trailing, decrease it. And there's usually not much point going above 60 seconds with a fairly fast lens. But if you're using a slow lens, but you have a good mount, you can try 120 seconds or 180-second exposures. But that's the starting point that I recommend. In terms of processing, for mirrorless cameras and DSLR cameras, there are a few different options I've listed here. Deep Sky Stacker is still a fairly common one, but it's very old now, so I recommend other options instead. That's what I used for most of my imaging life before I moved over to PixInsight, and it's completely free. You can use Serial, which is completely free and will stack and do some processing as well. APP is another one that's a paid one, but it's not very expensive. You can also stack in PixInsight, which is paid and fairly expensive. I think I paid something like $350 for it. But this is a case of buy once, cry once. So if you do think you're going to be serious about astrophotography and you plan to do it for the rest of your life, then it's worth spending the money once, because PixInsight is the gold standard. But if you're just doing it for fun once in a while, something like APP or Serial will do a great job. And then after stacking the images, you can process the images in Deep Sky Stacker as well, but its options are very limited, so I don't recommend it. I processed a lot of my images in Deep Sky Stacker for quite a while. It has the option despite popular belief, but it's very limited. I recommend using GIMP instead if you're looking for free software. It does a great job, and it's available for Windows and I believe iOS as well as Linux. You could use Photoshop if you already have that. It's paid, but I don't recommend buying Photoshop just for doing astrophotography. At that point, you might as well buy PixInsight. So it can stack and process images. And as mentioned, PixInsight is the king of processing software. It does it all from A to Z, but it is very expensive. And the differences in the final results for beginners are going to be very minor. The results that I can get using Deep Sky Stacker and GIMP aren't going to be that far behind with a beginner data set compared to using PixInsight. So for anyone who's just testing the waters, I might recommend getting started with a free software like Serial instead of jumping in headfirst and buying PixInsight and then not liking astrophotography. So the final results you'll get won't be that different. Now, if you have a fantastic data set and you have a great telescope and a great camera, then of course you can do much more in PixInsight to tease out all that final detail compared to what you can do in Serial or or Deep Sky Stacker. Now, for lunar, solar, or planetary imaging, some of the tips are that people think you need a planetary camera to do planetary imaging. As you saw from some of my earlier images, even a cell phone can do it, despite popular belief. You can use a phone, a DSLR, or mirrorless camera, which I've done for a long time. You can use your deep sky astro camera. Just because it's marketed as a deep sky camera does not mean it can't do planetary imaging or lunar or solar imaging. The only difference is that it has a larger sensor. Now, if you are using a deep sky camera or an astro camera like the ASI 294, ASI 2600, you just have to use crop mode or a region of interest to get a fast enough frame rate. Now, on the right of the screen, you can see that I took a screenshot from SharpCap, which is the program that I use for planetary imaging. And where it says capture area, all you have to do is select that and select a lower resolution. On a deep sky camera, your resolution might be something like 6,000 by 4,000 pixels. You don't need 26 megapixels or 24 megapixels when imaging Jupiter. So click on the capture area and select a smaller capture area, such as 800 by 600 pixels, which I recommend. And that will immediately increase the speed, the frame rate of your deep sky or your astro camera. And it'll be just as if you are using an actual planetary camera. And I've actually gotten my best ever results using my deep sky ASI 1600 camera for planetary imaging, even compared to my actual planetary camera. Because generally I have found that the deep sky cameras, because of their much larger sensors and sometimes larger pixels, have better dynamic range. So they are definitely very capable as long as you follow these rules. Now you want to select .avi or .ser as the output format on the right here. You don't want to be, you don't want to deal with 10,000 FITS files or 10,000 TIFF files individually when you're doing planetary imaging, because you will have a lot of individual files that way. Whereas if you select AVI or SIR, you'll just get one video file. Select Mono 8 as the color space for planets. And for planets, it's good to just have Mono 8. There is no reason to select Mono 16 or color 16. You just need an 8-bit file because the dynamic range for planets is not that great. Then you want to adjust your frame rate to between 30 and 120 frames per second, whatever the fastest your camera can do, and then adjust the gain until your histogram is at about 75%. Now, a histogram is, I will show you what it looks like. I'll open up SharpCap here, and you should be able to see that in a second. There we go. So I will just select a test camera. So this is not a real image. This is just a sample. So I can select the capture area. I have this in AVI. I've selected Mono 8. Mono 8 or RGB 8, whatever the color space is going to be, that's 8-bit. You don't need 16-bit. Then I will go down to the, I will select the frame rate. So I will select, in this case, 1/60th of a second, which is a good value. And then I will look at what the histogram looks like down here. The histogram is the difference between your darkest part of your image and the brightest part of your image. At the very left is completely dark, 0 values. At the very right is the brightest value that your camera can display. So you want your histogram here to be somewhere around the 75% mark for planetary imaging. And after you have selected your exposure time, you want to adjust your gain. So if my gain is too dark, I look at the histogram, and the histogram is all the way to the left over here. If my, I'm just going to make this bigger so you can see it changing in real time. There we go. So you'll see me changing the gain. So as I move the gain to the right, you can see this histogram bar moving to the right. So if my gain is too high, this histogram is hitting the right end of my histogram, and the image is very, very overexposed. You don't want that. So for planets, you generally want your histogram to be somewhere around the 75% mark. That'll give you a nice, well-exposed image for the planets. Now, for different planets, you can play around to see what gives you a good value, but 75% I found is roughly a good value. So there we go. I'll close this out. And then for lunar or solar, you want to set your frame rate to between 30 and 120 frames per second, whatever the fastest is that your camera can do, and then adjust the gain until the target is well exposed. For lunar or solar imaging, you can set your color space to 16-bit. So on this mono camera, I would select mono 16. On an RGB camera, I would select whatever the 16-bit option is. So you get good dynamic range, because lunar and solar, you can take advantage of the wider dynamic range. There's very bright areas and very dark areas. Now, if you are using a DSLR or mirrorless camera for lunar, planetary, or solar imaging, you want to take video in the camera. And then your camera is generally going to take the video usually in MP4 format these days. And then you want to convert that MP4 format to AVI or SER, which is what all Astro software uses for video. And you can do that using PIPP, which is a free software, which I've talked about a lot on my channel and I've made tutorials for. And then you want to process the video in AS3 or Astro Surface. And then you can sharpen the resulting image in Registax or Astro Surface. And we'll be doing presentations on processing using these softwares for planetary imaging in future sessions as well at the RASC. And one of the types of telescopes that are becoming very popular now are smart telescopes. So this image on the right was sent to me by Josephine, and this is the C-Star S50. So all credit to the images taken with this scope that I'll show, and goes to Josephine. And these telescopes are becoming very popular due to their convenience. So some popular ones are the ZWO C-Star S50, which is currently my recommendation because it's so cheap, $675. Celestron Origin, which is the new one that Celestron just came out with. It's a 6-inch scope, very, very fast. Costs about $5,400, which is above my budget. But for someone with deep pockets, I think that would be a great option, or someone who wants convenience and a great scope. There's the Unistellar Equinox 2 right now that is available for about $3,300. And there is the Vaonis Vespera, which is a small 2-inch scope. But again, $3,400. It is a little bit expensive. Vaonis does have another model as well, but it's not available in Canada anymore. So that's why I only put this one model. So advantages of these smart telescopes are that they are very easy to use. They do not require any polar alignment. So you just plop it there, connect it to your phone, and you're good to go. It has built-in plate solving, so it'll automatically find the target, and it'll live stack, as you saw kind of with my phone, but it'll process everything right on the telescope. It has a built-in battery and Wi-Fi, so it makes it more convenient, transfers the images directly to your phone. They're extremely portable, and the lower-end ones are great value, such as the C-Star S50 and the Dwarf 2. Cons are that they all use pretty small sensors, such as the one that comes in your cell phone camera. The results are limited by the Altaz mount. So because you can't do polar aligning, you can't image for, let's say, 30 hours straight and produce a phenomenal image. Your results will be very, very good for a telescope that's that portable and easy to use, but they will be limited compared to a proper equatorial mount or a large equatorial mount. And the cost is high compared to what you're getting for the more expensive ones, such as the other ones I had discussed besides the C-Star S50 and the Dwarf 2. So these are some of the images that Josephine had sent me from the ZWO C-Star. On the left is the Orion Nebula. In the middle is the Crab Nebula. And on the right is, using the solar filter, the sun with that giant group of sunspots that we saw recently. So considering how little that telescope costs and everything that it comes with, and that it finds things and basically does most of the hard work, the not fun part of the work for you, I think this is excellent value. And all credit to these three images goes to Josephine. So thank you for that, Josephine. And to choose between mono and color is one of the main issues that most astronomers face at some point. So for more serious astrophotography, a cooled astro camera is generally recommended. So it can be a cooled color or a cooled monochrome camera. On the left is my cooled ASI 294 monochrome camera. On the right is my new ASI 2600 MC Duo color camera, also cooled. So with the monochrome camera, of course, you'll need the filters, whereas with the color camera, it has everything you need. Now, I made a little chart here to help you decide what works better for you. For the color camera, also known as OSC or one-shot color, it's very convenient. You only need one set of frames. It's less limited by the clouds. So unlike mono cameras where you might get images through the red and green filter, and before you get images through the blue filter, the clouds move in, and then you might have to wait 2 weeks before you get a clear sky, before you can get that blue filter data to make an actual image. Color cameras do not have that issue. The total cost is lower. Modern one-shot color cameras have great image quality now, like absolutely excellent image quality. So you're not missing out on very much by going color. And they are more suitable for RASAs or hyperstars than mono, because you just have the camera at the front. You don't have a filter wheel sticking out. You don't have to worry about manually changing filters all night if you're going through 5 or 6 different filters. So that's the reason I switched over from my monochrome ASI 294 to the color ASI 2600 for my hyperstar system. It's been very convenient and I have absolutely no regrets. For the monochrome, there is a potential to get better quality data than a one-shot color camera. There's no guarantee you will, but in the hands of an experienced imager with good quality filters and the right telescope, potentially you can get better results. The monochrome cameras can be significantly more efficient if you're doing narrow band imaging, so like hydrogen alpha or oxygen. And they can also cut through light pollution a little bit better, but one-shot color cameras are catching up because you can buy dual band filters now that are very narrow. So it's not as much of an advantage as it once was. And monochrome cameras are significantly more efficient for broadband imaging. That's regular imaging of galaxies and nebulae and everything else, if you are using a luminance filter. So luminance filter lets light in through the entire visible spectrum all at once, instead of having to do red, green, and blue separately. So that makes it more efficient for pretty much any broadband targets, galaxies, nebulae, whatever you might be doing. Okay, so selecting, so now that you've hopefully gotten some good tips on selecting or choosing between a color camera and a mono camera, here are some of the basic principles of selecting gain or ISO settings for your camera. So dynamic range is the difference between the darkest and the brightest part of your image that your camera can capture without losing any data. So if we look at Orion, for example, the core is showing some detail. It's not completely overexposed, whereas there is still good detail showing in the very outer regions. And this was an image I took a very, very long time ago before I was using any fancy processing techniques. But because I was using a DSLR camera, a mirrorless camera with pretty good dynamic range, I was able to get detail both in the core and the outer regions. But you do have to know that dynamic range, which, as we discussed, drops as you increase your gain or your ISO. And read noise, which is generally how noisy your image is actually going to be, and is often seen as grain, is generated by the electronics of a camera, and read noise decreases as you increase your gain or your ISO. That might sound counterintuitive to anybody who does daytime imaging, because as you increase your ISO, your image appears to get noisier. But in reality, for the same exposure time, the images taken at a higher gain or higher ISO will have overall lower noise. So you can do some experiments to test this out with Astro images, and I assure you that is how it works. So to get the best gain settings where you will have high dynamic range, your camera can get good detail in the shadows and in the brighter regions, as well as low noise, so your imaging is as efficient as possible. You have to find the balance between these two things, the dynamic range and the read noise. And you will do that using these two links. Now, I had previously stated that for almost all DSLRs and mirrorless cameras, for beginners, you can basically just select ISO 800 or 1600 and leave it at that. But if you want to get into the nitty and gritty of things, these are the two charts that I would use, the dynamic range chart and the input referred read noise chart. So you click on this link on the site called Photons to Photos. And on the dynamic range chart, I took a picture of of a DSLR, the Nikon D850, which is a very good one. And at the bottom, you can see the ISO settings. At the left-hand side, you can see the photographic dynamic range. The higher the dynamic range, the better the camera will perform. So as you can see, as the ISO increases, your dynamic range decreases in a linear fashion. But if you look at the read noise, as your ISO increases, at one point here, your dynamic range just drops, your read noise just drops very quickly. So at this point, there's no point imaging right over here because your read noise is very high, but your dynamic range right over here is good. But if you go just a little bit further, you increase your ISO just a little bit further, your read noise is going to drop in half, but your dynamic range is only going to drop a tiny bit. So this is where you want to be with this camera. You want to be imaging at ISO 400, so you can still get a very good dynamic range, but low read noise. So very, very simple in this case to figure it out. However, if you go to a camera like the Canon 6D, which is an older sensor design, you can still see that the dynamic range decreases in a fairly linear fashion. However, the read noise drops in little discrete jumps as the ISO increases. So at this point, ISO 800 or ISO 1600 will do just fine. So there's no particular setting here that'll be the best. But ISO 800 has a read noise of 2 electrons. ISO 800 on this graph will be roughly here. Dynamic range is still almost 8 stops, so it's pretty good. ISO 1600, the read noise does drop from almost 2 electrons to about 1.3 electrons, which is an advantage, but the dynamic range drops a little bit as well. So in most cases, I use ISO 1600 for the Canon 6D. It's just about getting the best balance of dynamic range and read noise. If you go all the way here to ISO 6400 on this camera, your dynamic range at ISO 6400 is going to be a good bit lower. So you're losing dynamic range. But on most cameras, it is simpler to see where the read noise drops, and that's the setting that you want to use for ISO. Now, length of individual exposures is another thing that you want to think about. So length of individual exposures is limited by the tracking accuracy of your mount and the amount of light pollution. Usually, these are the limiting factors. Recommendations: use longer individual sub-exposures, such as 2 minutes, 3 minutes, whatever you can get away with, as it can be more efficient than using many shorter exposures for the same amount of total exposure time. So what that means is 15 exposures of 60 seconds can be better than 60 exposures of 15 seconds. They can give you a higher overall signal to noise ratio. That's why you can't take 10,000 exposures of 1/30th of a second to image the Andromeda galaxy without tracking, because it'll be a lot less efficient. If you're using narrowband or dual band filters, you can use longer exposures. For most beginners, 60-second sub-exposures are a good starting point, no matter what camera they're using. And to determine the minimum recommended sub-exposure length for popular astro cameras, I recommend using the Google Sheet calculator developed by Stephen Bellavia. And this is a link to Cloudy Nights where he posts those calculators. If you click on it, it gives you a list of all the popular cameras: ASI 2600, ASI 294, ASI 1600. Of course, that also applies to all the QHY cameras in the same range as well. So QHY 1600, QHY 294, they all use the same sensor. So you just using that sheet, you just input the values: how dark is your sky, what focal length and focal ratio is your telescope, and it'll give you the minimum recommended exposure that you should be using. So that's the best way if you really want to get into the nitty-gritty. And if that calculator tells you that you can get away with using 15-second exposures, well, that's great. You can get away with it, but you also don't want to end up with 10,000 images by the end of the night if you're getting a lot of exposures on an object. So then starting from that minimum exposure that it recommends, then you can increase your exposure length to something reasonable to get, maybe at most a few hundred frames. So it's easier to deal with and it doesn't take up your entire hard drive. And now programs for image capture and guiding. For more advanced image capture than just clicking the start button on your DSLR camera or using an intervalometer, you can use some programs on your computer. You can connect your DSLR or mirrorless camera to your laptop. This is mostly for Canon or Nikon DSLRs, as they have the greatest compatibility with astronomical software. You can use a free program called Nina, which I have been using for a long time, and I know a lot of the other members at the RASC also use. Benefits of using Nina to connect your DSLR or mirrorless camera or astro camera is that it supports just about every CMOS astro camera and most Canon and Nikon DSLR or mirrorless cameras. It allows completely automated imaging runs with multiple targets. So your telescope, if it's connected to your computer, will automatically move on to the next target. It'll take as many pictures as you want of each target. It can automate the capture of flat frames and other calibration frames. It works with free guiding software such as PhD2 to manage guiding as well. And of course, Nina is free, so there's no reason not to experiment with it. Only downside is that it can be a little bit more complicated than just hitting the shutter button on a camera or on an intervalometer. That's the only real downside. But again, nothing wrong with just hitting the shutter button on your camera or using an intervalometer. It does simplify things as well. Now, I want to talk about the importance of calibration frames. Since we're getting a bit closer to the 75% mark, I will go a little bit faster here. Calibration frames are frames such as flats, darks, dark flats, bias frames. So on the left is a image that I had taken with a Canon 6D. It's my uncooled DSLR, 30 minutes of total frames. This is just a straight stack of them with darks, flats, and bias frames. So the standard calibration frames, which I will discuss next, and no processing at all was done on this. On the right, you can see the same image, the exact same data, but I did not use any calibration frames. So no darks, no flats, no bias frames. What you will notice right away is that I can see more detail in the image with the calibration frames, mainly because at the very edges over here, there is less vignetting, less darkening, because the flat frames have taken all that darkening out. They have compensated for it. Whereas on the right, you will see that the outer edges of the frame are a lot darker because of vignetting. And you get that in daytime shots as well, but it's less noticeable. So because of that, you don't see as much detail in the object itself. Now, this is zoomed in a little bit on the same data near the center. You can see a lot more detail in the nebulosity around the Pleiades compared to what you can see in the image where I did not use any calibration frames on the right. Now, you might be wondering if this is just because of the flat frame. So what I did was I zoomed into that image, I think 200%. On the left, you can see the calibrated image where I used the calibration frames. On the right, you can see the uncalibrated image where I did not use the calibration frames. In the right image, the uncalibrated one, you can see this really, really bright red hot pixel. And over here, bright blue pixel. Same over here, same over here. These are called hot pixels, and they are because of defects in the image sensor, which pretty much all cameras have. And these pixels are permanently at 100%, even if there's no light coming into the camera. And using dark frames completely gets rid of them. On the left one, you can see a tiny little slightly darker pixel left in that region, but that looks a lot better and is a lot easier to take care of than this bright blue pixel. And the reason that little imperfection is still left is because my frames weren't perfectly temperature matched. I will discuss that later. The other thing you will notice is that there is less overall noise in the image on the left compared to the image on the right, because the dark frames do reduce noise as well. The difference isn't very noticeable. It's fairly subtle, but it's there. And then lastly, as you saw, the flat frames corrected the calibrated image much better than the completely uncalibrated image. So there's no darkening on the edges, or not as noticeable. Now, with a more advanced camera, like my cooled ASI 2600 MC camera, left image used, of course, used all the calibration frames, and there was no other processing done to it. This is a completely raw stack. On the right, exact same data, but no calibration frames, no darks, no flats, no bias frames. You can see that it's much easier to see and pull out the data in the image where I used calibration frames. Now, you might be thinking, if after processing, you can just, fix up the image on the right to look like the image on the left. You can somewhat. You don't have to take flat frames. You can use dynamic background extraction, which is a process in PixInsight. But I used the exact same dynamic background extraction process in both of these images. And what you would notice is that the calibrated image is still much better. On the uncalibrated image, the edges are still darker, and there is this weird black ring around the middle where I couldn't quite correct as well using the dynamic background extraction. Spending a lot more time on it, I could make this uncalibrated image look closer to the left image here, but taking flat frames is so easy that there's no reason really not to. It'll save you a lot of processing. The image on the left had no other processing done to it. It's just a straight stack of 3-hour images of the Horsehead Nebula with dynamic background extraction done in PixInsight. Same with the right one. Only difference, I used proper calibration frames on the left, did not use any calibration frames on the right. So that'll save me a lot of time in the long run. Now, if you're wondering what the heck a calibration frame is, I made this helpful chart for you, and it's just based on my experience. And so light frames on the left here, these are your normal images. So why take them? Well, because you want to get some data. How many of them to take? Well, as many as you can. You can take an hour or you can take 30 hours, but eventually you run into diminishing returns. To get the same improvement going from 15 hours to 30 hours, as you would between 30 hours and taking more, you would have to take 60 hours of images. So eventually you end up running into diminishing returns where it's just not worth spending that extra 30 hours to get a little bit more improvement. But take as many as you can. Dark frames remove hot pixels and other noise from your images, as we discussed. For uncooled cameras, it's best to take them right before or after your light frames, so they're at the same temperature as your light frames. And for cooled cameras, you can take dark frames anytime, as you can control the temperature of your camera. And these are taken at the same exposure time. So if your light frame is 60 seconds each, you want your dark frames to be 60 seconds each as well, at the same gain and ISO as your light frames, but with the lens cap on. So the dark frames are going to be completely dark, but they will just have the image noise and hot pixels and all of that. So you just put your lens cap on. And you normally want to take about 30 dark frames. That's sufficient. Beyond that, you start to run into diminishing returns again. Sometimes if I'm going to be taking 1,000 light frames, I might do like 50 dark frames, but there's no real benefit going beyond that. Flat frames, these remove the vignetting or the edge darkening and the dust spots in your image, because no matter how clean you keep your telescope, there will always be some dust on there. It's best to take flat frames right before or after your light frames, as low or once the sun comes up. Actually, you can't really take them right before or after unless you are using a flat panel. But you don't want to move your telescope too much, because you want your telescope, your camera's rotation and focus point to be the exact same. Because if you take your camera off your telescope, the dust might move around, or your camera orientation might be different relative to your telescope. So then they won't correct for those dust spots properly or the vignetting properly. And then you want to make sure that the temperature of your light frames, like matching the temperature of your light frames is not important in this case. Your flat frames can be a different temperature, but it's always best practice to try to take your flat frames at the same temperature anyway, just to keep things simple. If you're using a cooled camera, it's a no-brainer. Just leave your temperature at the same setting as your light frames. But again, it doesn't have to match. You must take your flat frames at the same gain or ISO as your light frames. They can be taken by pointing your telescope at the blue sky away from the sun, or by pointing your telescope towards a tracing panel. If you've ever done any arts and crafts, you know you can get those cheap tracing panels on Amazon for $30, $40. That's what I use most of the time. So then I can just put the tracing panel on top of my telescope and adjust the brightness and take the images. So you want to adjust the exposure time of your flat frame until your histogram that we had looked at earlier is around the middle of the graph. Or if you're just doing it by eye, make sure your image is not too dark or too overexposed, because you want it to be able to correct both the dark areas and the bright areas. And usually about 30 flat frames is sufficient. If you are using a monochrome sensor, it'll be 30 flat frames per filter. And bias frames. So bias frames remove the fixed pattern noise, which you might see as little grain in the back of your image. And it's I just take them right before or after you've taken your light frames, because it takes so little time to take bias frames. You can take 100 of them in a minute. So best practice to just do it right away. Matching the temperature of your bias frames to your light frames isn't important. It makes very little difference, but I take them at the same temperature anyway, because why not? It takes so little time. And how to take bias frames? Well, you take them at the same gain and ISO as your light frames. You take them with the lens cap on, just like darks, but at the shortest exposure time that your camera can take. Usually that is 1/4000th of a second or 1/8000th of a second for most DSLRs or mirrorless cameras, and 1/32,000th of a second usually, or something around that for most astro cameras. So just set your exposure time to the shortest possible. And usually about 60 bias frames is sufficient. Beyond that, you do run into the law of diminishing returns. So I just take 60 and call it a day. And since they're so short, 1/4000th of a second, you can take 60 of them in a minute. And lastly, dark flats. These are taken instead of bias frames for cameras such as the ASI 294 or ASI 1600. Cameras that do not do well with bias frames. Those are the two main ones you need to worry about. In that case, you take dark flats. So you when to take them, you take them right away after your flat frames, because you want to use the same settings as your flat frames for these. You just put the lens cap on. So they have to be taken at the same temperature, at the same gain or ISO, and at the same exposure length as your flat frames, but with the lens cap on, just like darks. And you should take the same number of dark flat frames as your flat frames. So if you took 30 flat frames, you want to use 30 dark flat frames. So you don't want to use both bias frames and dark flat frames. Normally just use bias frames, but if you have one of these cameras that I listed here, then do not take bias frames, take flat frames instead. So I hope this chart will be a useful reference, because when I was new, it took me so long to try to figure out what each of these frames does and how many to take. So this is a helpful guide for beginners. Again, not a definitive guide because there are always exceptions, but for 95% of people, this guide that I made should work well. So planning an effective imaging session. We're getting to the end game now. So the key to getting a great image is planning ahead. You don't want to be winging it in the field and trying to decide, what target to image or what type of frames to take and what gain or ISO to use. So my process is to first find a suitable target using telescopias.com. It's a free website that does a great job of showing you what targets are up there right now, how big they will look on your telescope, and how long you can image them for before they get too low. And you can use Stellarium, which is free on Windows and Mac. It's a beautiful program. Some people like Card to Seal as it's easier on the system in terms of requirements, but Stellarium is, oh, I don't know why that stopped. Sorry, that's just reloading here. I will just start that again. We are near the end here. Okay, so yeah, I have a plan B. Let me just... Okay, or actually, I think it's loaded again. Oh, there we go. Okay, it's loaded. There we go. I will just share my screen again from here. Sorry about that. Don't know why that crashed. Yeah, so I use Stellarium on Windows and Mac for figuring out what targets are up, what time they rise and set, what they're going to look like, and it's a beautiful program. So I use that. I don't care too much about the system requirements because it just looks so much nicer than Card to Seal, so I prefer it. For Android and iOS, if you're using a cell phone, Stellarium Mobile and Sky Safari both have free versions of their software, and they're great for figuring out where things are in the sky. Setting up, then I set up my telescope and polar align if I'm using an equatorial mount. If you're using a smart telescope like the C-Star, you don't have to worry about that. Just plop it down and you're basically ready to go. I let my telescope cool down to ambient temperature. I want to make sure it's at the same temperature as outside, so I might leave it out there for an hour to cool down. Otherwise, your image won't look as sharp because of tube currents. I turn on the camera cooler about 5 to 10 minutes early just to let my camera cool down. I find and center the target that I'm going to be imaging. I focus my telescope either manually or automatically. I do that after the telescope has cooled down a bit, just because the focus point can shift if your telescope is warm or cold. And then I turn on my guiding if I'm going to be guiding, not needed if you're not guiding. Okay, and I hope that is full screen. Okay. Sorry about that. I don't think that was showing properly. There we go. Okay. And then I start my imaging run. And then once that's done, I take any calibration frames that I need right away so I don't forget about them. And then I go and process my image. That's basically it. So your process doesn't have to look exactly the same, but have some sort of a process and write down your most used settings. So what gain you normally use, what ISO to use. Personally, for me, I have only 2 sets of settings that I use, one for the summer, one for the winter. For the summer, I set my camera temperature down to -10 because that's the coldest I can do if the outside temperature is 25 degrees Celsius. For the winter, my camera cooling temperature is set to -25 degrees Celsius because that's as cold as I would ever be imaging in. And my camera can always reach -25 degrees in the winter. So those are the 2 settings that I have, and I have dark frames that I use for the winter and dark frames that I use for the summer. And I use the exact same exposure length for pretty much all targets in the summer and the winter. It keeps things simple, and I don't need to create a massive dark library. I do redo my darks every 6 months to 1 year, but again, you can keep using the same darks and bias frames unless you notice an issue and then take a new set. So that is it. We made it to the end, and we have good 15-20 minutes to spare, and we can stay longer as long as people have questions. So I really hope that was useful, and I will open to any questions and suggestions. And this video, of course, will be on the YouTube channel as well for RASC Edmonton, so you can reference it later as well. And yeah, all the information will be available over there. So I will pass it back to Jay for any comments and questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Abdur. That was super informative, so thank you very much for that. I think everyone has the ability to unmute themselves, so if you do have a question, just feel free to unmute yourself and ask.
Hey, Abdur, thank you. That was very nice. So a question at the beginning, you showed your the camera lens. I think it was the Rokinon lens that had the attachment at the bottom. If there's a way to put a link on that, because I've been looking for something like that.
Definitely. I will switch over to my regular screen now instead of, let's see what I can do here. Okay.
I think you had a bar on it at the bottom.
Yes,
so
I will share that right now. I've got it right here. Okay. So
that's the one. Yep.
There we go. Okay. So what I did in this case was basically, this is a regular bar that I bought off AliExpress. You can get these Vixen bars at just about any telescope store. And to attach it to my lens, I bought this little lens adapter. Normally, this kind is for a Canon lens. I'll put in the comments of the YouTube video on the RASC Edmonton website the link for it and exactly what it's called, because there are a few different sizes. So I'll have to look up how many millimeters the diameter of this one is. But yeah, it's not made for this lens, but I found it fits perfectly well. So you can just open it up from here. And then all I did was I used 2 screws to attach it to this Vixen bar. And now I can use this in any astronomy tracker or any mount. So that is much more secure, I find, than using the 1/4-inch hole at the bottom of any camera, because I find if you're using a hole, it just tilts over time and then your camera is pointing somewhere else by the end of the night. So check out the RASC Edmonton YouTube video once it's up, and in the description, I'll have all of those links. Also, the images that I shared here today, they'll be much higher quality on the RASC Edmonton website, the YouTube video, because the presentation that I'll send to be posted over there, or actually, no, they'll be the same. They're decent enough quality, but I'm sure I can link the presentation somewhere as well with the higher resolution videos. Zoom it, compress it a little bit, but that's, yeah, not a huge difference. But thank you for that, Kellen.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Any other questions?
Robin Foray is next with a question.
Oh, yes, thank you. That was excellent, Abdur. Thank you so much for that presentation.
Thank you.
I have a question about the tridapter that you had, that you showed early on. Does it have any felt on the inside? What's your experience with that? I'm thinking, like, would you want to put that on one of your, oh gosh, I'm drawing a blank, but if you've got expensive eyepieces, it looks like it clamps to the eyepiece. And of course, you don't want to be marring the outside of that eyepiece.
Excellent question. So full disclosure, this tridopter was actually sent to me by the company Move Shoot Move to see what I thought about it, because I was using this basic one that I'd won at the Northern Prairie Star Party, which was great. I was very happy with it for what it was. But once I tried the tridopter, I could not go back. So that's just full disclosure, but I'm reviewing it for them. But any opinions on this are completely mine. It's not sponsored or anything like that. I do really like it because right on the inside, I'll see if I can get a good view over here. There is felt at the top and the bottom. And at the bottom over here, there's felt as well. Okay, we'll use this thing as an eyepiece. We'll pretend this is the eyepiece. So it just goes right in here, right at the bottom here. And then this top part just locks it into place. The sides over here, there is no felt, but none of your eyepieces will ever be touching the side. It's self-centering, so it automatically there we go. So it locks it in, and both of the surfaces that are touching the eyepiece have decent lengths of felt. So I've never had an issue where it was rubbing against my expensive eyepieces.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Okay, I just have a couple more things I'd like to mention. One is the RISC Edmonton Center also has what we call our telescope loaner program. So if you're interested in trying out any one of those types of telescopes that Abdur spoke about in the beginning of his presentation, you can go to our website, and on our menu, there's an option called loaners, and it's free. So you have to put a small deposit down if you're not a member, and it's a fully refundable deposit upon return of the telescope. But we have a huge variety of scopes there for folks and mounts actually for folks to try out. So it's perfect for this type of thing as you learn astroimaging. And I think that's about it for now. If you are ever interested in more workshops or advancing your astronomy interests, the RISC is a great society for getting to know more and getting to know people that are all varieties of folks, levels of interest and expertise in astronomy. And you could always, again, go to the Edmonton RISC website, and there's a menu option there called Join. So we'd be always looking for new members. So I think on that, again, thank everyone for showing up and sharing in our evening tonight. And what a wonderful job, Abdur. That was really, really informative. So thank you very much, everybody. And I bid you good night.